everybody, to this newest edition of the Silver Screen Action Figure Podcast. This is your host, Andre Joseph of AJ Epics Productions, and we're doing another special interview episode. Previously, we did it with the Junkman from YouTube, talking about classic action figures from the 80s and 90s, specifically the ones that were produced by Kenner. So now we're back at it again, but this time I wanted to shift the perspective and talk about the business of comic book shops, in particular small businesses, because we have to support our communities, and it's one of those things that, especially for me as a collector growing up and going to antique shops, going to comic shops and finding my favorite toys, those memories were just as meaningful as going to Toys R Us and KB and bringing my collection together at home. So I figured the perfect way to get into this conversation was to plug a store that I regularly go to that's been around for some time now. This was the winner of TimeOut New York's Best Shop in Staten Island in 2016. And what I'm talking about here is Hypno-Tronic Comics, right down on Stuyvesant Street, right by the Staten Island Ferry. And with me today is the owner of the shop, Joy Ghiglotti. Say hello.
Hi. Stuyvesant Place.
Stuyvesant Place, right. It's been a long time. I used to go to Curtis, and
Yeah.
It feels like yesterday, but it's like a millennium ago. I'm so happy to have you on today, and there's so much that I want to talk to you about to educate the listeners about what you guys do and just the importance of your business, particularly when it comes to pop culture and the need for, young people and adults who collect comic books and action figures. And, the funny thing is, though, when I first heard about you guys, because as you may or may not know, I also produce films. So I was working with a friend named Jim Harkins many years ago. He did a movie called Love in Four Panels, which was sort of a love story short film dealing with two cosplayers and their difficulties with their interests. And he met with Ed Varuolo, who, your husband, and God bless his soul. He was an amazing man, and we're going to talk more about him today. And he got the okay to shoot over there for a couple of scenes. I was the cinematographer for it. So that was the first time. It was like one of those things where, here I am in the store trying to focus on my job, but I can't help but look around this place and I see like every toy I used to collect, even the ones that I've always wanted, all the comic books. I mean, everything around your place is just such eye candy. And, I've come there every now and then, sometimes when I come back from the city or from jury duty, and just to check you guys out and support as much as I can. So, Joy, if you can, tell us, the listeners, what Hypno-Tronic Comics is all about for anybody that's never been there.
Well, we're an independent comic book and collectible store. Because we're not corporate, I choose a lot of this stuff. Everything's handpicked. Used to be by me and Ed, and unfortunately Ed passed away last year, so it's just me now. And we're different. It's like Midtown Comics has to toe a corporate line. Most large stores have to toe a corporate line. I have latitude to pick out things that go in the store. We specialize in horror and sci-fi and fantasy. So I have a lot of stuff that you're not going to find in most other stores. And a lot of books, a lot of different books. It's like I'll take a chance on some independent titles because I look at them and I'm like, this looks really cool. I want to stock this, and so the things that you find in my store that you're not going to find in any other store.
I totally agree with that completely. Like growing up on the island, especially during the 90s when I used to collect the Marvel trading cards, you had a couple of shops here and there. Like there was this one that I remember right across from Danino's Pizza, and I don't remember the name of it, but that's where I used to get a lot of my comics and my cards. And this other place down on South Beach, and of course Jim Haley's Universe right down on...
Yeah, the place in South Beach was Krypton.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So I remember.
The reason that we opened the store was, unfortunately, he was a victim of Sandy.
Oh wow!
And it destroyed his shop. And when he said that he wasn't going to reopen, that's when Ed and I decided that we were going to open a store, because we didn't want to compete. There were 3 stores here. We didn't want to compete, but when he wasn't opening, we figured we would fill his void.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely, guys, you were able to pull that off because, I mean, you're in the perfect location where you got Curtis High School, you got the St. George Ferry, and you have the St. George Theater. So it's like you're bringing in a wide variety of people that just even just passing by, they're attracted to it in a sense where they don't have to go to Forbidden Planet in the city or Midtown Comics because most of the stuff that they have, you guys have in a much more smaller location, but there's enough there for people to really run in, and I'm sure you guys have done pretty well over time.
Well, yeah. We do okay. We do okay. We could always do better. So you people who are listening to this should come in, check us out. But basically, Midtown Comics and Forbidden Planet, they have their place. It's the same thing. It's like basically it was Comic Book Jones, unfortunately, closed.
Yeah, I love them too.
And JHU, but like we all had a symbiotic relationship basically, because it was just like I'm gonna send customers to JHU like I did to Comic Book Jones, like we've always done together, because I'm gonna send them to them for new books, and they're gonna send customers to me for vintage stuff because I have a lot more vintage stuff. I don't have as many trade paperbacks as they have. I don't carry as many new titles as they do, but I carry, I carry far more vintage comics than anybody in the area.
That's actually one of the questions that I have for you is between the comics and the toys that you guys stock up, how do you find your merchandise to stock in the store?
Well, we buy and sell. I mean, we had a pretty large collection when we opened, and we bought like a warehouse of comics. We invested in this, like, I think a couple of 100,000 comics. Um, Ed calls it the Bronx score, and it was just like just like it was a tractor trailer full of comics that I still have not sorted through all of them, and that's what we opened with. So it was just like I'm still sorting through that, though. By the way.
Of course.
But I still buy and sell. It's like if something comes in here that I think is interesting, I'll buy it. Anytime somebody comes in here with stuff, it's like I can offer, I offer about 25 to 30% of what I think I can sell it for, or I offer them a little bit more in store credit. And it depends on the popularity of the item, and of course, like with comics condition. But we get cool stuff because of that. People, stuff is like, it's funny because it's like we used to have to go searching for stuff, and stuff has fallen into our laps because we have a place where people can come to.
Yeah, you talk about like I was looking at an interview with Ed on YouTube recently, and one of the things he was talking about was how a lot of old things, like say, the Universal monsters or movies like Back to the Future, Aliens, Predator, when those things came out during those specific times, there wasn't a tremendous amount of merchandising going on because nobody really knew until like
Yeah,
later on how
right.
big of a revenue you could make by selling toys, selling comic books to expand the storylines, or doing all kinds of amazing looking dolls that look identical to what you see in the movies. And being that this is action figure podcast that's specifically focused on movies that eventually turned into toy lines, talk about how like what's old has become new and how that's become increasingly popular with today's audience.
Well, it's funny. It's like we had a Phantom of the Opera. I mean, it was a silent movie. We have a Phantom of the Opera action figure, and I think I got a case of them, and they sold out. It's like it's a silent movie, and it's like that action figure is still like people will look at it and go, "Oh my God, I have to have that." It's like Frankenstein. Anytime I get any kind of Bride Frankenstein stuff in here, it goes immediately. Um, Especially now, it's like I have some older figures, but now the stuff that they're creating, and they're creating just these amazing figures. I mean, it's like, when you look at stuff that Hot Toys makes, I mean, it's just incredible. It looks like a human being. It looks lifelike. And they didn't have this stuff then, but like now they can make this stuff, and it's just incredible that we're at this time now with toys are unbelievable. The stuff NECA's putting out is great right now, and reasonably priced. And right now it's like Mego is putting out a lot of new stuff. Mego is producing again, and you have very reasonably priced figures that are pretty high quality, and they look cool, and they're in like vintage type packaging, and people who like science fiction are able to find stuff a lot easier than they used to be able to, because it's getting more prevalent, because there are people out there who really it's driving the market, because people excuse me, I'm like tongue tied here, but people are actually searching for that kind of stuff, and it's like they're hungry for it, because every time we get it in, it sells out.
Yeah, you see that's what I find. Like, I mean, now I just turned 36 over the summer, and I was a huge avid toy collector up until I got into high school, and it wasn't the cool thing to do anymore. But then, as I got older, especially in later years when Hot Toys and Sideshow Toys, even NECA, like when they started putting out not only the figures based on these movies I grew up on, but then started doing those homages, like taking the Kenner Alien toys and translating them with the NECA figures, or doing like old school packaging with the Star Wars toys. I mean, that's suddenly like I was afraid to pull out my wallet for some of this stuff. It's just like, why could they have this back then? And given that where we're at right now, where you see like Toys R Us, pretty much it was gone. Now it's kind of coming back, and it seems like kids today are more glued to a screen as opposed to wanting to take a toy and play with it after school. Um, that leads me to my next question. Like, in terms of the customers that you get, what's like the typical age range or generation that you see most of the time?
Well, it's mostly it ranges from everywhere. It ranges from like teenagers to like 80. I have customers. I have very young customers. I have kid customers to the elderly, because there's really kind of something for everybody. It's like between the comics and the collectibles. Um, there's a lot of mostly middle-aged guys come in here, and it's funny because they just look up and they're like, I have to have that, I have to have that, I have to, I didn't have that when I was a kid, and I want that, and now I can afford it. And those are the kind of people that come in, and they're just surprised at stuff that, or it, kind of walking through here is like walking through a museum sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah, you're looking at stuff and you're just saying, I wanted that when I was a kid, and I'm like, well, now you can have it.
Or other times it's just like you see it and then you're like, well, what am I gonna do with it other than display it on my wall? But I gotta have it, So
Well, it's like I have toys. Like some people hang paintings, some people hang. I have toys all over my walls. I have toys, and I have movie posters and stuff like that. That's my decor. I have like and what is it? Diamond Select. Diamond Select does these, does great toys. They really do. And I mean, again, reasonably priced, but great toys. And then they had this Muppet line, and they have like a Waldorf and Statler.
Mhm.
The Muppets, the guys who sit in the balcony, the old guys.
Yes.
And it's my favorite thing, because they put out one with a balcony. They got the two Muppets in the balcony, and I have that in my wall in my living room, to watch TV with.
I should get that for my dad. He loves those too.
Yeah, they're great. They put out such great stuff. It's a thing. Again, it's like, people come in here and they're not even into it. And, they'll look around and they'll see something like that and they're like, I have to have that.
Right. Another thing too is, like there are times during the day where obviously it could get busy, or sometimes you might have like a dry day. But, being that we're in Halloween, Christmas is also around the corner. What's like typically like your busy season during the year?
Usually Christmas. yeah, Christmas is usually the most busy. Halloween, not so much. I mean, I do get business during Halloween, but I really don't have. I don't have a lot of the. I can't really compete with Party City, places like that because again, my shop is small, so I'll have a few masks, but I can't do full costumes or anything like that. And I really don't have the room for makeup. So Halloween, it's like I sell some stuff for Halloween, but the big sales are usually around Christmas.
Another thing too is like we've seen obviously this whole surgence of comic book movies, and I mean that's gone on for an over a decade now, and the merchandising for that too has also really gotten really amazing. I mean, between Black Panther, Avengers Endgame, Spider Man, and some of the DC stuff, even though, I mean, that's another story for another day. But, do you see like any kind of surge in sales when certain movies hit the theaters? Like
Oh,
suddenly,
yes.
yeah, everybody wants a comic
Yeah.
book or everybody wants that action figure or that mask.
Yes. Yes. I mean, things that nobody paid any attention to before. It'll drive up. It's like Guardians of the Galaxy. You used to be able to get the first Guardians of the Galaxy, for cheap in the dollar box sometimes. That skyrocketed. Anytime there's a new character, well, not a new character, but a character introduced to a movie, usually their first appearance goes up. And then, of course, yeah, it drives action figures because everybody needs to have them.
Right.
So,
Um,
like Deadpool. Again, it's like, Deadpool was popular, but after the movies came out, Deadpool, all of my, I think the first week the first movie came out, we sold out of every single item pertaining to Deadpool sold out.
oh, wow. Yeah, I can imagine so. Like, I also remember when Deadpool first got released, and all of a sudden, everybody was cosplaying or getting the
Exactly.
action figures or the comics. I mean, that became revolutionary in
Right, because
itself.
I mean, Deadpool was popular in his own right, but like when the movie came out, and it's like all these people who had never heard of Deadpool or never read comics before and just saw the movie, all of a sudden they were just like, "Who is this Deadpool?"
I want to kind of turn attention to yourself in asking, like, were there comic books or were you ever into that type of stuff when you were growing up?
I was never into like DC or Marvel or mainstream comics. I was into all underground stuff, just anything that I was not allowed to read. Anything. I used to work in a head shop. There used to be a head shop on Port Richmond Avenue,
Okay.
and when I was like clean windows and sweep up and stuff for comic books and rolling paper. The rolling paper I would use to make newspapers for my Barbies. Because that's the kind of thing that I did. It's like, but it's great because it's like, I wouldn't have, this was the 70s. You could do stuff like that in the 70s. You cannot do that now.
Oh, no, definitely not.
But the 70s, it's like I would work, he would give me like comics that were totally inappropriate for a child, But I love them. I love, the violence, the craziness, the sex. It was just like, I read, I used to read anything that they said I wasn't allowed to read, I would read. When I was in the second grade, I think it was like, I wanted to see The Exorcist. They wouldn't let me see The Exorcist.
Oh,
So
wow.
I read the book. I read the book. And they should have just let me see the movie because my imagination with the book was not a good thing.
Oh, I can imagine so. The book being much more scarier, especially at night
Yeah,
reading it.
yeah. That was a weird little kid.
I had my eccentricities myself. I mean, even as I was first into Marvel, I was buying up a lot of the Punisher comic books, and I don't think my parents realized, especially like the War Journal comics, how violent they would get.
Right.
And like unlike every other character that was a superhero, and the X-Men saving the day or Spider-Man going through teenage puberty, here was a guy who was a Vietnam vet who's out killing mobsters and thugs, and just like that character for a long time resonated with me. And then my cousin, he got into Spawn, so I got into Spawn as a result. and that took it to a whole nother level. So I mean, like, it wasn't just always for us those clean cut characters, but it was really like those guys that really gave it some edginess and grit that honestly you were almost craving to see in a movie.
Right. Yes, exactly.
So like, even as we were discussing this, and I mean, there's so many great things we could talk about the store. I mean, it just feels right to just talk a little bit about Ed, because I remember when he used to do industrial television. There were times when I stayed up late at night, even in eighth grade, and that stuff would sometimes freak me out. But yet, I would find it very amusing and very fun on a weekend. And just in general with him, like every time I went into the store, I mean, he was just the sweetest guy. I mean, you could tell how much he loved that store. He loved the stuff that he was selling, all the comic books, all the toys. And even on like a bad day when I'm just like on Instagram, I could see like the videos he puts up when he's like promoting a comic book or a toy that
Right.
he's selling, and it would really bring a smile to my face. Like he
Oh
could
yeah, we
really
used to
like,
have such a
yeah.
good time making those videos. So basically, we spent a lot of time just cracking each other up. We would do stuff that, like, whether anybody else thought it was funny, we thought it was funny, and we didn't care. It's just like, and sometimes we'd have to do like 5 or 6 tapes because we'd be laughing too hard because just dumb things we were doing. But yeah, Ed loved this place. He loved what he did, and he loved talking to people about movies and comics and anything pop culture, or especially industrial television. He loved talking to fans about industrial television. Like, we would be like walking down the street. I think we were walking down the street down Manor Road one night, and all of a sudden, like, somebody screams out of their van, "Industrial television rules!" We just every place we went, like, people would point them out and have to come and talk to them and tell them how much they loved the show or hated the show or were scared of the show. But it was fun because that was how I met Ed, because I was a fan of the show, and I was just like, this. I met him in the post office one day because I knew he lived in my neighborhood, and I was just like, I just want to tell you that I'm a big fan of your show. And he's taken it back because he said mostly women didn't like his show.
Wow.
Which is not really true, but it's just like most women just didn't tell him that they liked the show because I think they were a little intimidated by him. Which actually is, I was a little intimidated by him because I wasn't sure. It's like I don't. Should I talk to this guy? But he's very approachable, and he loved talking about the show. And the show was one of those things where it was just this phenomenon. When I saw it, I was switching through the channels when people still did that,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a mortician's training film, and I'm like, what the hell is this? And I stopped dead, and I was a fan from that moment on. Because it's like, it's mortician, soft porn, old commercials, old cartoons, just weird stuff. And, it was such a great show, and it was before YouTube, so a lot of the stuff that he got, you couldn't find anyplace except for on industrial television.
Yeah, I mean, it was just like so out there. I remember the like the Death Wish poster that would talk in the background.
Chuck Bronson's lips.
Yes.
Let's ask Chuck. I know everything. It was just wonderful. It was so cool. It was just my favorite thing in the whole world.
Yeah.
I feel so privileged that I got to spend so much time with Ed. That I got to be there with him, because it was just like what he did. The show, him and Brian just put together this phenomenal thing. It really was. It was an amazing thing. They used to watch the public channel, and they used to say, "Oh, I could do better than that." And, it's like, and they just challenged each other. It's like, well, let's do better than that and see what happens. And they did. People used to come in for the tours at CTV, the ones who were making their own shows and stuff, and they would bow before the industrial television room where they edited. This is where the magic is. And it's like, and I've never seen anything quite like it's, before or after.
Yeah, no, nothing comes to mind, and even if there is, it's just polished compared to what those guys did, and
exactly.
It was raw and it was organic.
It was crude and politically incorrect, and again, it was like, it's like they would do Black History Month, and it's like stuff that you would never be able to get away with, but they could get away with because it was just like they were these two assholes, basically.
Right.
It's like that's what they were doing. They were just like, it's like, it's not racist when it's over the top racism that's so ridiculous it doesn't even make sense. They would make it so insane that it was just like, it's like neither one of them were racist, but like, it's like they would make it so like if you see it out of context, it's horrific. But in context, it's like, oh my God, that's what they're doing. They're just being assholes. And that was their whole thing. It was like let's not be racist, but let's be so over the top racist that nobody can take it seriously.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, I could say without a shadow of a doubt, like every time I ever think about him, or even as I've prepared for this and look back at some of those interviews, I just have a smile on my face because he would leave that kind of impression with everybody that he came across.
He was always happy to share his knowledge with people, and always happy to help. Anybody ever had any questions about what they were doing, he was always happy to listen and talk. He wasn't stingy with his knowledge, which was nice. A lot of people are, they get self-conscious or afraid to share knowledge, and Ed was never like that. Ed was more than happy to share what he knew.
Wow, yeah, that's very interesting. And you actually have pins made of his likeness.
Yes, those are noise pins. That's our friend Artem, and it's an Ed pin. He came in and made me cry. It was so beautiful. He just came in and he's like, I made this pin for you, and he gave me he gave me 100 of them, and he didn't want anything. He just wanted me to sell them in the store. They're incredible. They're great. I mean, it's like if you look on our Facebook page, our profile picture is the pin.
Yeah,
because I loved it so much.
I've seen it. It's really incredible.
It's so perfect. It really is so perfect. He took the perfect picture of it to make it.
He did that smile. Yes.
Ed is someplace, and he's seen it and is laughing at how he's being worshipped now. People are wearing Eds on their lapels. It's great.
I wouldn't even mind a Ed action figure if somebody could make one.
Oh, believe me, we thought of it.
Yeah.
We thought of it.
Maybe like a Mego style figure.
There is actually our friend Len Kaminsky. He's like the creator of War Machine, and he wrote for Marvel.
Oh wow!
And he made an Ed action figure for Ed, and it was like when Ed passed. I don't know where anything is. I have to find this action figure because it's like he made it from a Jack Nicholson, because Ed looked a lot like Jack Nicholson.
Yeah. And
so he made it from a Jack Nicholson doll. So there is an Ed action figure that was handmade by somebody.
That is amazing.
But I have to find it.
Yeah, I would love to see that one of these days if you ever post it up on Facebook.
Yes, as soon as I find it, I will post it. It's like there's so many things that I have to do that I haven't had time, because it's just I work all the time now, so I don't have a lot of time for personal stuff anymore.
Right, and it's also a rarity of like a female running a comic book shop, which I think is also something very significant in what you do. Even after Ed's passing, that you're keeping the legacy of the comic shop alive, and especially in this economy, I think that should be commendable.
Thank you. It's hard work, and it's difficult, and it's like it's kind of like, I feel, it's like I see what happened to Comic Book Jones, and I understand it because it's a rough business, and we have like razor thin profit margins, and the thing is, like, if somebody doesn't pick up their books, or you have orders for people that they don't pick up, and you kind of get stuck with stuff. It becomes very, very hard to keep up with your bills. And the thing is, it's like, I don't have a family. I don't, I'm not supporting anybody. So it's just me. So it's like, if I don't have to buy groceries, or if I can try not to, if I can move a bill back that I don't have to pay, I can do it. But, it's hard when you have a family. So I see how Comic Book Jones, it would be hard to stay open.
Of course.
It's tragic. I feel bad because I love that store and he did such a great job with it. But it's a rough business. It really is. Digital comics, I don't think affect the business as much as people think, because I think most people really want to touch a comic.
Yeah.
They like that tapped out feel. But it's just a matter of, like, people just having other interests.
Yeah, that's the challenge. I mean, mentioning about the action figures of kids getting glued to screens, it's the same. Well, with comics, yeah, people want to be able to physically buy a comic book, spend the time to actually sit down and read the pages and absorb the artwork. But we're in sort of like that, give it to me now kind of society where it
Right.
just seems like
And,
everybody.
it's like with a real, with an actual, physical comic book, a digital comic is never going to go up in value.
Yes.
As opposed, it's like, your physical comic may not go up in value either, but, your digital comic is definitely not. And it's definitely not going to become a collector's item.
Yeah, as we're starting to wrap this up, one last question I have for you is, like, what's the importance for as a small business to give back to the community and to sustain yourself in the community compared to these big name chains that are out there? Because, like I said, I mean, there may not necessarily be like a big chain comic shop other than Forbidden Planet. That's the only one that comes to mind. But the importance of having one right here in Staten Island. Could you address a little bit about that?
Well, when you're shopping at Hypno-Tronic Comics, or if you're shopping at JHU, the local comics on Staten Island, you're supporting, you know, the people that own it. You're supporting your community, because all the money that we get goes back into the community. It goes because we shop in the community and we shop at other places in the community. When you're shopping at, like, Midtown Comics, or you're shopping at Forbidden Planet, or you're shopping at one of those places, you're getting, somebody's yacht. You find another yacht for CEO. Yeah. And here, it's like, you're helping me pay my electricity bill. Or you're helping me buy groceries, or so everything's going right back into the community.
Yeah, that was definitely well said. So, if you can, plug where we can contact you, where we can find you, your social media, anything you like at this moment.
Oh, okay. So we are Hypno-Tronic Comics. We are at 156 Stuyvesant Place. The phone number here is 718-720-0001. We are on Facebook at Hypno-Tronic Comics. We are on Instagram at I think if you just look up Hypno-Tronic, we come up. We are on Twitter. I think it's Hypno-Tronic Comics, or just Hypno-Tronic. Hypnotroniccomics.com. And I think that's pretty much it. Basically, come to our store.
Yes, I encourage it too. I totally recommend coming to you guys, and you don't have to go online to go and find your latest toy or the latest comic book. It's right there. Especially if you're a tourist come from the city, you just have to walk a couple of blocks. It's not even that far. So I highly recommend anybody to come
We
out.
meet a lot of people from. What's great about this location is we meet people from all over the world every day, because they just, everybody takes the ferry to look at the Statue of Liberty. So we get to meet all kinds of great people.
Yeah, again, that's the advantage of having it in that very location, is just getting people from around the world to check out your store. And like I said, it's right there, literally in the best spot of any place on Staten Island. All right. So again, thank you so much for this, Joy. I hope you could come
Oh, thank
back.
you. It was an honor. I really appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, I'm just glad I'll be able to plug the store, and hopefully you could come back. Maybe we could talk about some of the toy topics that we usually do, because I would always love to have the female perspective on some of the stuff, not just a bunch of us guy nerds.
Yeah, sure, no problem. I would be happy.
All right, most definitely. And for everybody else, as always, you could like us on Facebook, the Silver Screen Action Figure Podcast. Follow us on Twitter at SilverScreenAF1. And if you have comments, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, email me at silverscreenafpodcast@gmail.com. All right, guys, thank you so much for this. I'll see you at the movies.